So what I thought I would do is ask our two panelists to reflect on this question. Can poetry still matter? If so, how does it matter? And perhaps more generally, how has poetry and poetry's role in public culture changed in the last 2 decades, which have seen vast changes of other kinds, socially and technologically? So let me give you each a chance to say something, and then we'll continue.
Can people hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Let me just start off by pointing out what's something that's sort of obvious, I suspect. How rare is it that we have a public discussion about poetry? When's the last time you saw one on television? When's the last time you heard one on the radio? And and it's true of poetry. It's true of most of the arts. Is that the element of just talking about, this is a phenomenon, what its role is, and everything else, has been declared a kind of unaffordable luxury or an unspeakably boring subject, I guess, depending on the perspective, by most of the media that we develop in. And I think it's even to a certain degree happened in the general education aspects of colleges and universities, which is one of the reasons that I thought it would be fun to do it. And let me just lay my cards on the table. I think of poetry as one of the fundamental human arts. And in fact, the arts are one of the things that make us human. Poetry has been around as long as we've been around. I mean, you can't find a moment in history or even our discernible prehistory in which it did not exist as a phenomenon. Now, if you go back far enough, what we think of today as somewhat separate arts, song, poetry, dance, were one art. It was the rhythmic movement of the body and rhythmic sound, as a way, before there was writing, as a memory, as a memory storage technology, a way of people, in a sense, articulating who they were, where they came from, what their stories were, what their hopes were. I mean, Robert Frost gave a very famous definition once of poetry, which was a way of remembering what it would impoverish us to forget, a way of remembering, what it would, and I love the verb, impoverish us to exist. And it does seem to me that we live in a public culture, especially. I had the rare luxury of choosing my own job title, and I wanted to put flaneur, but the USC didn't like that. So I said I want to be professor of poetry and public culture, to say that there was, in a sense, a role, for poetry and for the arts and public culture. But in our public culture, it is somewhat impoverished. The space has been almost entirely commercialized by people who want to sell us things, and and the substitutes of that. And so, if you go back to the origins of poetry as this continuous conversation that human beings have had in every language and every culture, it is a human universal. Anthropologists have never found a culture in which poetry or song, did not exist. This conversation which has gone on since the beginnings of what it is to be human, which has allowed us, in a sense, to articulate our mortality, our movements through time, our very existence. It seems to me it's important. It is our most expressive, concise, and memorable way of describing our own existence in words. And I being entirely sort of a Paleolithic thinker, I can't imagine ever a time that, as long as we use language, of poetry not being valuable. Now, there may come a point, even within our lifetimes, where the direct electronic plug they put into our brain allows us to do the media directly, but it seems to me it's irreplaceable. I worry that we are in a historical moment, in a culture, even in an economy, which is trying to replace it, trying to take that space and fill it with other things. But it seems to me it is one of the spiritual disciplines, one of the arts, one of the aspects of language that is worth fighting over. So that's sort of, tell me where I'm wrong, Sven.
I could begin to. I think Dana's done a beautiful and articulate job in laying out the premise of deep cultural continuity and historical continuity of poetry. And if we're laying our conversational cards out on the table in order to sort of break this open and see what are the sort of issues, problems, conflicts, worries, and salvations of it all. And I don't think we're in any disagreement. I would say my slightly more, well, I'm coming at this not as a poet, for starters. You're speaking as a poet.
Thank God,
Yes.
I say.
When we were sitting over there earlier, I forget the exact context in which, but I threw out the phrase that poetry nowadays is kind of the petri dish activity in terms of sort of determining where things are going and where they have been and what are possible outcomes. I think I enter this topic as somebody who's been thinking a lot about the transformational nature of media, digital culture, and what has happened in a extraordinary kind of leveling rush in the last few decades. And I think that intervenes and cuts across some of the kind of continuity that you were outlining, and I think it creates a new set of questions and topics to address. Basically, I think, to put it into an absolute nutshell, which we can then break the crust on and look at, but I would say if you took the dominant overall energies of the culture at large, and I mean culture in the broadest sense, embracing economics and technology and so on, the vector of that, to my view, is going in one direction, and what poetry has always been and what it, in a sense, stands for pretty much represents the opposite principle of that. I don't think the two assimilate readily to each other, and that's why poetry is so interesting for me to think about. I read it for a whole set of other subjective reasons, but in order to think about culture and how we live and outcomes and the fate of subjectivity and of language and so on, I think it has a different way it can be looked at. And I think that's where I'm both interested and alarmed at the condition of things, because I think the broadest energies of our culture right now are pretty much moving away from whatever might be called, certain ideal of subjective individualism. I think that is an endangered attribute, and I think that's the very attribute that poetry directly addresses.
No, I think that's so true. I mean, if you think, one of the scariest things that modern technology allows is to, break us up into smaller and smaller and smaller target groups. But the objective of that is always, simply to treat us as manipulatable group identities. Whereas, and perhaps all of us have some part of our existence which is best described in statistical clusters, with other people. But it does seem to me that what poetry does, what literature does, is call forth our individual potential to realize irreducibly individual elements of consciousness, of existence. I mean, it seems to me that if we recite a poem at the moment, everybody in this room will hear it slightly differently. Now, I say that as somebody who was, I think I was raised in sort of new criticism, which at some older level sort of said, well, there's a text, and you unravel, the ultimate and comprehensive interpretation of the text. But everybody comes in here with their own life history. You will hear the same image slightly differently depending on what memories it evokes. You bring no two of us, even if we've read the same books, have read the same books in the same order, have read them at a point where they mean something. I mean, and we just know this. If I read a book when I was a teenager. I thought it was hilarious. I read it as good as an adult. I find it heartbreaking. The things that I could easily laugh at 16, having myself then lived through, I no longer find so funny. It's still a very good book. But what seems to me, what one of the primary spiritual energies that poetry and literature unleashes is a heightened sense of our own consciousness, a heightened respect and understanding for the complexity and independence of the consciousness of others. I don't think this is as abundantly or as carefully developed by the media alternatives to the novel, to theater, to poetry. And it is true that cultures and people and societies lose certain capacities. And I worry that we're losing in our society some of those capacities, some of which are intellectual, some of which are spiritual, some of which are the ability of emotional projection and emotional understanding that poetry develops. And it really comes from, and they are not easily replaceable by the other disciplines in a university. When you hear what the power of poetry, power of literature, is that it speaks to us not as thinking individuals. It does not make its primary appeal to our intellect, but talks to us simultaneously as thinkers, as feelers, as rememberers, as inhabitants of a physical body, to our intuition and our imagination, without asking us to separate them. It treats us as complex and incarnate beings, which is different than the appeals that philosophy makes to us, or sociology or psychology, which are necessarily primarily analytical and intellectual. And so even if we have superb intellectual strength in our society, in the sciences, in the social sciences, and things like this, we cannot afford to live in a society which does not educate and mature and refine and awaken our emotions, our imagination, and our intuition with the same care, the same intelligence.
I was thinking as you were talking that I wanted to make a certain kind of distinction, but then I'm wondering whether it's a distinction that will be a shared one, or that people in this room will relate to or identify with. Because I think there is something, in the broadest sense called the artistic aesthetic experience. I think there's the specific thing we might call the literary experience, which is encounter with the written word, whether it's, reading a novel or a great essay, whatever. I think there's something very particular which has to be identified if we're talking about poetry as a separate entity, which to me is the whole ground and meaning of poetry, what makes it different and special. I know that the poet A.E. Housman said that he knew he was in the presence of poetry if he was shaving and a certain line occurred to him and he cut himself. I think that was his thing. And Emily Dickinson spoke of the feeling of when she encountered true poetry, it was as if the top of her head was being taken off. That there is actually something that is available in this particular form, which is not the very same thing that you would get reading a great novel even. It's a particular, not only distillation of language, but a particular mode of intensified address. And I think it's the thing that those people who go on and want to both read and possibly write poetry can usually identify somewhere back in their formative origins, one or many experiences where that happened. And it happened so unambiguously that it was a version of falling in love. You can't unsay it, you can't undo it, it's there and you know it, and having experienced it, you look for more. I was just curious if people sitting in this room could identify, just taking a moment to think back, if there was some point of encounter with some poem, I don't know, between your ages of 12 and 20 that you definitely felt something change in the nature of things. And if yes, just put up your hand. I'm just curious whether that's what we're talking about. Okay, so it's not a completely mysterious thing I'm talking about. To me, that is very much, and I'm sure that happens with people who are driven passionately toward music in a different frame. But with poetry, I think it's very much a product of those things that Dana was enumerating, which is a simultaneity of something reaching you in the intellect, in the heart, in the physical body, and doing so mysteriously and overtaking you. The thing I want to say is that for that to happen, I think it always needs, for the individual, it needs a kind of contemplative space within which to happen. I don't think it can happen when you're not fully attending. And I think if you extrapolate outward to the culture at large and ask about the place and meaning and purpose of poetry, I think you need to question whether the culture itself has a kind of available contemplative presence, sort of an accessible ideal of a contemplative life. And that's the thing when I said earlier that I was worried, about the two vectors going in different directions. I just feel that that is the thing that's under threat. I don't feel that poetry's under threat. I feel that what's under threat is the thing that allows the experience of poetry to happen, which is an utterly undistracted ability or capacity to let language actually have its effects on your
But then
readerly
poetry is under attack in that
Yeah.
an art without an audience is a kind of museum piece.
Right.
One of the things interesting, how long ago was that Harvard? 35 years ago? I guess I was at Harvard in grad school, and there were certain assumptions. I mentioned this at lunch today, that, one of the assumptions is that poetry would never again be popular. That it was going to be, as something, it was really the province of an intellectual elite, because they were the only ones smart enough, who could unravel it. And it struck me as that was a kind of doomed definition of an art. I mean, any art that was in that situation was over. It's like cuneiform. There are some people that can still read it, but it's not, doesn't have much parlance. And one of the things that I've noticed, since then was, how wrong it was. Is we talked about this a little bit at lunch today too, which is the invention of hip hop and rap, the creation of poetry slams. And I'll give you an experience of my own, which is that when I came to the National Endowment for the Arts, one of the things, the main reason that I accepted this job, which I had refused repeatedly, even though I knew that the NEA was in desperate need of salvation, was the fact that everywhere I went in the country giving readings and lectures, I'd have a Q&A. And I never had a Q&A anywhere, north, south, east, west, big city, country, in which at some point in the Q&A somebody didn't say, they have just canceled the arts programs in my school, in my child's school, in my grandkids' school, in the school in which I teach. It was this, they were shutting this whole thing down in our school system. So I wanted to create an arts education program. I wanted to do something we could do quickly and that we didn't have to have, $200 million to do, just as an example of the transformational capacity of, of introducing arts in a meaningful way to the education. And what we came up with was Poetry Out Loud, this National High School Poetry Recitation Contest, which when we presented it, most of the arts education specialists of the state said, this is a terrible idea. It will never work. And the reason is that we wanted to have kids memorize and recite poems in competition. Classroom level, school level, town level, county level, state, and nationals. And they said, first of all, to memorize is repressive. This is reminds us of the worst excesses of the Spanish Inquisition. Secondly, kids, nobody wants to do the arts in competition. Now, next year, American Idol came out, and so they just didn't want to do it. But I felt that if you could give the average kid, a chance to memorize a poem and to inhabit the poem. Think of the metaphor, to know it by heart, to put those words in the very center of your being, the life force of your being, that maybe if this was an art that had the power that I imagined it to, the poems would start to do their work, would start to work their magic. And, to make a long story short, this year, with very inadequate funding, 500,000 high school kids will memorize and recite poems in competition, and it's this huge success. It's become the signature program of the state arts organizations. Now, one of the things I predicted, and they looked at me like this was even stupider than the idea itself, as I said, I bet it's not your A students who are going to win. I said, I think it's going to be the troublemakers. All these kids that, they've got all this energy and they have nowhere to productive. We call them boys, generally, or theater people, and sure enough, I mean, they were, these kids that came in, and but I would say about, on a national level, about 50% of the state winners, which means that they've won, that in order to get up there, you've won against, tens of thousands of other kids. About 50% of the state winners are first-generation Americans. And there's also this kind of, this ancient wisdom. I mean, isn't one of the oddest things that still goes on is that nobody likes poetry anymore. Nobody thinks it's worth much, but we still keep it in education out of some primitive superstition that it's always been there, and if we take it away, something bad will happen. And when it started showing us is why it's there. It's this ability to in a sense, by inhabiting great language, by inhabiting great sensations, great thoughts, in a sense, you increase your capacity both to feel and to express those things. And I think it suggests that poetry, if we took it away from this kind of suffocating academic superstructure we've created for it, still has enormous and direct human appeal, and that it's not primarily an intellectual appeal. These are these kids you can't typify in any way. In terms of this, they find some kind of human use, and that's, I think, what we've forgotten. I mean, nowhere in my education at Stanford and Harvard did anybody ever talk about why human beings need literature. What are the human purposes of art? And this is what I think, Sven has just finished, he just sent me the proofs of a superb essay that's going to come out in poetry, which I think is although you don't term it in that way, it's very much about that. What are the profound human needs that poetry awakens, satisfies, addresses? Do you want to talk a little bit about what you were after that essay, or have you already moved on to bigger things?
It's that I've forgotten everything I said in it. It will surface as we.
Yeah.
It was less.
He takes a series of sentences, these magnificent sentences from Emerson, and then sort of puts them out there and meditates one. I mean, let me just quote one that I read it, and then you can just.
Well, yeah, I'll fill in.
I'm probably misquoting it, which is that Emerson says, the world, it seems, is always waiting for a poem, or the poem.
Well, this essay in question, I was aware, in the way one is sometimes if what you do is right, that you feel a kind of pressure sometimes of certain ideas and topics and things that you desire to express, and you cannot for the life of you think of exactly how to do it. And I think I became aware of this with respect to just thinking about poetry a lot in some of these terms that I've been outlining earlier as we talked. And I just one day thought of an experiment, which is that I took what I knew to be a supercharged, idealistic, and almost kind of take no prisoners celebration of the meaning and power of what poetry could be by Emerson, which is his essay called The Poet. And I thought, well, what if I, for 10 days, every day, open this essay at a certain point and each time go a little further in and find one sentence on every page that I open to that strikes me, and then just reflect on it. And the instant I opened the essay and began rereading it, it just struck me that on the one hand, here was somebody who was speaking with kind of a transcendentally intimate familiarity to me of, sort of in the voice of the ages, and I was, reading it as one reads great things, and on the other hand, I was actually trying to import the implications or sense of what he was saying about the poet and poetry and actually relating it to my day-to-day experience of living a fairly literary life. I mean, I move among literary people and I teach and so on, but I realized that, it's 150 years that separates the writing of this essay from our moment, more or less, and that it was like this astonishing, on the one hand, an astonishing gulf. If anyone stepped into a public arena and began speaking as Emerson speaks in that essay, they would quickly be carted away for one thing or another. And on the other hand, it made perfect, beautiful sense. So it seemed that there's this extraordinary split between how we live and possibly that thing of maybe there's something else, which is the how we live and what we want. And the poetry addresses the latter, the what we want, which is maybe the sense of that phrase you cited that, there's a feeling that we're always waiting for something to be delivered. It's not going to be delivered in a satisfying sense by anything we hear in the political arena. Very likely it's not going to be delivered the economic, it's got to come from somewhere. And it finally comes down to really, we're in the realm of ultimates in a sense. And I'm aware, even as I speak, that I should get out of the realm of ultimates quickly because there's so much to talk about that in a way is, the life we live in poetry as it's practiced and the culture. And I didn't want to keep hijacking this into the, the poet and the soul and the meaning of things, but
why not?
Well, we can do that too.
We
But
can't do it here. Where can we do it?
Well, that's
but
true.
I mean, it seemed to me one of the things that rereading that sentence from Emerson and in your meditation on it, this notion, as we go through our lives, which are complex, overburdened things, and they've always been for everybody everywhere. I mean, ours may be differently burdened, but they've always been, throughout history. And we go through this world which is changing around us. Our bodies are changing. Our sensibility is changing. And we have this, I think, natural human hunger to have what it is that we experience now articulated. I mean, there's some things about our life that are not entirely real until we say that, we admit that we describe them. When you're in love, until you've shared the experience with somebody, it's not entirely real, and even in your own life. And what poetry does, and I think what Emerson's talking about is that poetry is our most profound and effective. I mean, if you believe, for Emerson, this is medicine that works. Yeah. That in a way of, in a sense of constantly redescribing and re-articulating, the dynamic experience of what it is to be alive, and which is why you always need a poet, because some things have always changed. You've always changed, and it was a kind of a recognition that at some basis what we have in art, satisfies a profound human necessity. I mean, it's really interesting. One of the most interesting day I had every year as NEA chairman was when I had lunch with the NEA jazz masters. I would say the average age was about 80. Mm-hmm. And these guys had, really for the last 40 or 50 years, had made a pretty bad career choice. The money had gone elsewhere. You had a couple of people like Dave Brubeck or Herbie Hancock who were still getting pretty good fees, but most of these guys, they were just barely scraping along, and they loved what they did. They loved each other. Even if they fought and shot each other, 50 years earlier, they had all survived together, and they had done something, in a sense, had articulated a view of the world that nobody else was going after, and it was into always, which is the basis of our artists. It was always wedded with delight and discovery, joy and illumination, and it's that hunger, the thing that's so wonderful about jazz is that it's quasi improvised. The performances are different. In the sense that you can't just play the same song again tonight the way you did it last night. You have to, in an Emersonian way, make it of the moment. And I think, and that's the hunger that I think that will always be human, but I worry that we are satisfying with less and less nutritious food these days.
So let me ask you a question, because at some point earlier you were saying that the book, which I think is the one coming out this spring, you had written essentially in isolation, that you go away and you have a place that you sort of take yourself away from the world, and that's where your most intense recent bout of writing. And that's kind of a place without urban contemporary distractions from the sound of it.
Yeah.
But the other thing we're talking about is, in order to create an ongoing literature and poetry that works for people, it has to keep representing the life experience that most of us have most of the time, which is usually quasi-urban and very often not out in nature. We are in offices at desks looking at pixelated screens, and yet that has become the substance of our lives, and yet there's poetry that needs to be made. And I'm not saying that if you're out in nature, you're necessarily writing about it, but I think
it's a very,
how do you...
the answer is you always take your life with you. Joyce left Ireland when he was, I don't know what, 20 or something like this, and that's what allowed him to write about it. But what I find, and the reason that I try to isolate myself, is simply the noise level of life today. There's Thomas Merton, the poet who became a Trappist monk, had an interesting story, which is that it's a common experience for Trappists. They go away, they take this vow of silence, and I'm not asking anybody here to join the Cistercian, order of strict observance. And so they go there, and after about 6 weeks, they're talking to their confessor, who is a kind of psychoanalyst, as well. It's the person, and they start saying, I think I'm losing my mind. I'm hearing voices. And then this is when the confessor says, "Good, you've reached the first stage. These are the voices that have always been inside you, but the noise of your life has deafened out." And the noise level of our life, the old cliche, "I can't hear myself think," is never been truer than today. And so what I find is I need to get away. No one can phone me. No one can email me. This, that, the other, and then I can begin to hear what I really think about something, because I'm not reacting to, just to the moment. And I do think that that is, silence is a luxury, and in some cases is an unwanted luxury. It was very odd. about a week and a half ago, I took a long walk through the woods of Northern California with a Dominican friar who has the chair of theology at University of Fribourg. And he'd wanted to meet me, and so he'd come up to meet me. And we were walking through some of the most beautiful places in the world, just spectacular. And we're in a late afternoon, and it's just this magnificent, I hate to tell you, but this is like California, around 1st of February, it's about 75 degrees, I mean, it's just magnificent. Everyone we passed was wearing headphones. And it says something to me that people cannot even experience, magnificence, perfection without a distraction. They cannot be alone with I could see if they were walking through a tannery or something and they want a distraction, but they can't even experience the sublime without some entertainment going on in the background. And I do think that we're at a moment where we can't hear ourselves think, and in fact, some people think it's a virtue not to hear themselves think. They aren't comfortable with their own thoughts any longer.
But when you hear yourself think, when you've created this writing situation for yourself, and finally things clear out and you're able to address yourself in language the way you want to, how do you find yourself drawing on the experience of your contemporary living?
Well,
But I'm just curious.
I mean, every one of us is a contemporary.
Right.
So the whole thing is that even the getting away is part of the contemporary experience.
Exactly.
I don't know. I think it's, for me, it gives me a sense to reflect on things. I don't think any of the poems that I wrote were actually set, where I was, or came out of that moment. They were, they were things, and so it allowed. Memory is the mother of the muses. And I think some of it was just, allowed memories to come back and to recombine in things. For me, when I write a poem, I don't know if other poets in the audience feel this way. When I get the inspiration for a poem, it is physiological. I feel it here, and I feel it here. And that part of my body begins to tingle in a way which doesn't when I get a good idea for a joke or a good idea for an essay or anything else. And I feel it's physiological, and it's, and then you begin to pursue it. And I don't really know, where it's going. But I think that in general, the slight displacement of your daily routine often gets your mind working, because you're sort of on automatic pilot. Because our lives are so busy, we just have to get through things, and somehow when you put where everything is a little different, where you can't, you don't even know where you're walking because you've not, walked there before. It tends to give a kind of heightened sense. But my poems were. I'm trying to think about. I don't think a single one of them was actually set. I went to Waldron Island, which is the outermost of the San Juan Islands. It's about half a mile from Canada. There's no electricity, no plumbing, no shops, no nothing. So you get a dark, cold cabin, and it's, and you're alone with your thoughts and nature, which is not a bad gal to have a conversation with.